Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. In this video, we will talk about Article 7, the Executive Department. First, let's define executive power. It is the authority to enforce orders and to ensure they are carried out as intended. The executive power is vested in the President of the Philippines, Article 7, Section 1. To make it easier for us to understand the executive department, first let's talk about the Avengers, the Earth's mightiest heroes. Have you ever watched Avengers? The members of the executive department is like the superheroes of Avengers, with a wide array of abilities. Now, let's meet our superheroes in the executive department. First, it's the president. The president of the Philippines is like Captain America, the drop-dead gorgeous hero who leads the Avengers. Our president is similar to Captain America. He is the head of the state and the head of the government. As the chief executive, the president exercises control over all the executive departments, bureaus, and offices. He also has an official residence called the Malacanang Palace. Next in line is the vice president. This is the second highest official in the Philippines. He is like Iron Man, the second in command. Of course, we also have the cabinet. The cabinet members serve as advisor to the president. These members are similar to the other members of Avengers to complete the team like Black Widow, Hawkeye, Hawk, and Thor. The cabinet is composed of the vice president and the heads of the executive department. They are nominated by the president and must be confirmed by the Commission on Appointments. Now, let's answer the question, how do you become a part of the executive department? To answer this question, it is important to discuss the qualifications of the president and the vice president. They both have the same qualifications and is elected in the same manner. Here are your qualifications. First, natural-born Filipino. Second, a registered voter. Third, must be able to read and write. Fourth, 40 years of age at the day of the election and must have resided in the Philippines for 10 years before the election. The start of office for the president and the vice president is on 30th day of June, following the day of the election, and it will end after 6 years, noon of June 30. Both the president and the vice president can also be removed through impeachment. Let's move on to their term of office. For the president, it is 6 years and can only serve for a single term only, and not eligible for any re-election. Now, it is also important to take note that any person who has succeeded as president and served for more than 4 years shall not be qualified for election to the same office. The vice president can also serve for 6 years and starting and ending the same time as the president. However, he can serve for 2 successive terms and is eligible to run for president. Now, it is important for you to take note of these numbers: 40, 10, 6, 1, 2. So what are these numbers? 40 stands for the age requirement of the president and the vice president. 10 stands for the number of years that the president and the vice president must live in the Philippines. 6 stands for the year's terms office of the President and the Vice President. 1 means that the President can only run for the election one time, and then 2 stands for the 2 successive terms that the Vice President is allowed to ride. Let's move on oath of office. Before they enter the execution of their office, the President and the Vice President shall take the oath or affirmation. So what is an oath? An oath is an outward pledge made under immediate sense of responsibility to God. Cruz 2002. The case of Estrada versus Deserto, Estrada versus Macapagal Arroyo, held. Resignation of Estrada cannot be doubted. In the press release containing his final statement, he acknowledged the oath-taking of Arroyo, emphasized leaving the palace, expressed gratitude for the opportunity to serve. He will not shrink from any future challenges, called on his supporters to promote a national spirit of reconciliation and solidarity. Certainly, the national spirit of reconciliation and solidarity cannot be attained if he did not give up the presidency. The press release was valedictory, his final act of farewell. The Congress had, by resolution, formally recognized GMA or Gloria Macapagal Arroyo as the constitutional successor of Joseph Estrada, by reason of his resignation as president. Let's move on to the presidential succession. There is always a chance that tragedy can happen to ensure continuity and stability of operations in the government. Article 7 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution provides a line of presidential succession. This line follows the order of Vice President, President of the Senate, and the Speaker of the House. To understand more about this topic, let's take a closer look at the presidential succession. Let's start with the vacancies at the beginning of term. If the president-elect fails to qualify or to be chosen, the vice president-elect will be acting president until someone is qualified or chosen as the president. But if the president-elect dies or is permanently disabled, the vice president becomes the president. Now, if both the vice president and the president are not chosen or do not qualify, or both die or both become permanently disabled, the Senate President, or in case of his inability, the Speaker of the House shall act as a president until a president or a vice president shall have been chosen and qualified. In case of death or disability of both the members, Congress shall determine by law who will be acting the president. Let's move on to the vacancies after the office is initially filled. If the president dies, is permanently disabled, is impeached, or resigns, the vice president becomes the president for the unexpired term. However, if both the president and the vice president die, become permanently disabled, or impeached or resigned, the Senate President, or in case of his inability, the Speaker of the House shall act as a president until the president or the vice president shall have been elected and qualified. Let's move on to the vacancy in the office of the vice president. If the office of the vice president is vacant as a consequence of the presidential succession, the president shall nominate vice president among the members of the Congress, who shall assume office upon confirmation of the members of the Congress. For example, when former President Joseph Estrada was ousted from Malacanang through People Power II, he was succeeded by the Vice President Gloria Arroyo. Arroyo became the President and the office of the President became VIGOT. The new President, Gloria Arroyo, was nominated, confirmed by the members of the Congress. Now let's talk about the temporary disability of the President. The temporary inability of the President to discharge his duties may be raised in the following ways. First, declaration by the President. If the President himself transmits a written declaration to the Senate President and the House Speaker, the Vice President becomes the acting President. Second, declaration by the members of the Senate. If majority of the cabinet members transmit a written declaration to the Senate President and the Speaker of the House of Representatives, the Vice President becomes the acting President. But if the President transmitted to the Senate President and the Speaker a written declaration that no inability exists, he shall reassume his office. Third, decision by the Congress. If there is a dispute between the President and the Cabinet members, the Congress will decide the voting requirement. Is 2/3 vote of both houses voting separately. If it reaches to the third, the Vice President will act as a President, but if fails to reach 2/3 of the vote, the President will continue his powers. Being President, there is limitations. So let's talk about the prohibitions and inhibitions. Article 7, Section 6 to 13. No increase in salaries during the term. Shall not receive emoluments. Shall not hold any other offices. Shall not directly or indirectly practice any other professions, business, or be financially interested in any other contract with franchises of the government. Avoid conflict of interest in the conduct of their office. May not appoint spouse or relatives by consanguinity or affinity with fourth civil decree. So let's move on the power of the President. First, the power of appointment. Power of appointment is the selection by the authority vested with the power of an individual who is to exercise the functions of a given office. Kinds of presidential appointments. Appointed made by an acting president. Midnight appointment. Regular presidential appointment. Ad interim appointment. In addition, appointments requiring the consent of the Commission on Appointments, heads of executive departments, except Vice President, ambassadors and other public ministers and consuls, officers of the AFP from the rank of colonel or the naval captain, officers whose appointments are vested in him by the Constitution. Not all cabinet members, however, are subjected to confirmation of the Commission on Appointments. According to the Commission of Appointments website, the following need confirmation in order to assume their posts: Executive Secretary, Secretary of Agrarian Reform, Secretary of Agriculture, Secretary of Budget Management, Secretary of Education, Secretary of Energy, Secretary of Environmental and Natural Resources, Secretary of Finance, Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Secretary of Health, Secretary of Justice, Secretary of Labor and Employment, Secretary of National Defense, Secretary of Public Works and Highways, Secretary of Science and Technology, Secretary of Social Welfare and Development, Secretary of Interior and Local Government, Secretary of Trade and Industry, Secretary of Transportation and Communications, Secretary of Tourism, Commission on Higher Education, Director General of the National Economic and Development Authority. The power of removal. General rule, this power is implied from the power to appointment. Exception, those appointed by him where the Constitution prescribes certain methods for the separation from public service. The next power is executive power. President shall have the control of all executive departments, bureaus, and offices. He shall ensure that laws are faithfully executed. Article 7, Section 17. Until and unless a law is declared unconstitutional, the President has a duty to execute it regardless of his doubts as to its validity. This is called faithful execution clause. The next power is military power. Commander-in-Chief clause. To call out the armed forces to prevent or suppress lawless violence, invasion, or rebellion whenever it becomes necessary. Vested directly by the Constitution. Authority to declare a state of rebellion. Military tribunals are simply instrumentalities of the executive power provided by the legislature for the commander-in-chief to aid him in enforcing discipline in the armed forces. Under the military power, suspension of writ of habeas corpus. A writ directed to the person detaining another, commanding him to produce the body of the prisoner at a designated time and place, the subject of which is the liberation of those who may be in prison without sufficient cause. Ground for suspension, invasion, rebellion, when public safety requires it. Effects of suspension of writ. Does not affect the right to bail, applies only to the persons facing charges of rebellion. The arrested must be charged within 3 days, if not they must be released. Does not supersede civilian authority. Under the military powers is martial law. Grounds for declaration, invasion, and rebellion. The following cannot be done. Suspend the operation of the Constitution, supplying the function of the civil courts and legislative assemblies, violate open court doctrine. Civilians cannot be tried by military courts if the civil courts are open and functioning. Automatically suspend the writ of habeas corpus. Constitutional limitations of martial law and the suspension of privilege of habeas corpus. Not more than 60 days unless extended by the Congress. President to report to Congress within 48 hours. Authority of the Congress to revoke or extend. Authority of the Supreme Court to inquire of the factual basis for such actions. And the next power is the pardoning power set in Section 19 of Article 7. Except in cases of impeachment or as otherwise provided in this Constitution, the President may grant reprieves, commutations, and pardons, and remit fines and forfeitures after conviction by final judgment. He shall also have the power to grant amnesty with the concurrence of majority of all the members of the Congress. So what is an amnesty? It is a general pardon to rebels for their treason or political offense. It so overlooks and obliterates the offense with which he is charged. Person released by amnesty stands before the law precisely as though he had committed no offense. Other forms of executive clemency, such as commutation, reprieve, parole, remission of fines and forfeiture. Commutation is the reduction of mitigation of penalty. Reprieve is postponement of sentence or stay of execution. Parole is a release from imprisonment but without full restoration of liberty and custody of law, although not in confinement. Remission of fines and forfeiture is to prevent the collection of fines and confiscation of forfeited property. Cannot affect rights of third party and money already in the treasury. The next power is borrowing power, said in the Article 7, Section 20 of Philippine Constitution. The President may contract or guarantee foreign loans on behalf of the Republic with the concurrence of the Monetary Board, subject to such limitations as may be provided by law. The Monetary Board shall submit to the Congress report on loans within 30 days from the end of every quarter. The next power is the diplomatic power. No treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective unless concurred in by at least two-thirds of all the members of the Senate. The power to ratify is vested in the President, subject to concurrence of the Senate. Other foreign affairs power. Power to make treaties. The power to appoint ambassadors, public ministers, and consuls. Power to receive ambassadors and other public ministers. Deportation power. The budgetary power is also the power of President. Within 30 days from the opening of every regular session, the President shall submit to Congress a budget or expenditures and sources of financing, including receipts from existing and proposed revenue measure. Congress may not increase the appropriation recommended by the President for the operation of the government as specified in the budget. The last power vested in the President is the informing power. The President shall address Congress at the opening of its regular session. He may also appear before it at any other time. The information may be needed for the basis of legislation. The President usually discharges the informing power through what is known as the State of the Nation Address. The President has the other powers, such as call the Congress to a special session, approve or veto bills, deport aliens, consent to deputization of government personnel by the Comelec and discipline them, exercise emergency, war, law, limited, necessary, and tariff powers. Power to classify or reclassify lands. That's the end of my video. This discussion is based on the link above. Thank you.